I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us, a new author. I actually have been working for the Government Accountability Center along with Peter Schweizer, the famous author of Clinton Cash and other best-selling books. But he's got his own book out, and I hope it becomes a bestseller for him because it's called Fraud, and it's how the left plans to steal the next election. That sticker is actually on the book cover right there. He is Eric Eggers. Eric Eggers, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Thanks, Greg. It's great to be here.
I know that your book is, you were saying that people are complaining that it's a short book. I think it's fabulous. I mean, I went through a lot of the book. There's a 38 pages of footnotes in it. It's a nicely done book. It has one example, boom, 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 after another. The left, the mainstream media, the corporate media keeps telling us there's no election fraud or voter fraud. Of course, Project Veritas and books like this say, oh, yes, there is. There is a lot of voter fraud, right?
Yeah, I think it's certainly going to be increasingly difficult to make the claim that there is no evidence of voter fraud after, I think, this book has come out. I mean, as you noted, we have 40 pages of footnotes, we have charts, so there's quite a bit of evidence, and I think as recent events have shown, it doesn't really take voter fraud to occur on a massive or national level for it to truly impact elections. At the Government Accountability Institute, where I work, we believe in a phrase called, show, don't tell. We want to see what the facts say, and then we want to allow them to speak for themselves. And so as the beginning of the process of this book, we gathered as many publicly available data rolls as we could find for actual votes cast in the 2016 election. So we started there. We got 21 voter rolls, and then we hired a data expert, and we contracted with a commercial database that's used to detect like EBT fraud, things of that nature. And we just analyzed and say, all right, well, what does the data show for actual votes cast? And Greg, what we found was quite honestly stunning. We found in the 2016 election what appears to be evidence of 2,100 instances of double voting in the state of Florida alone. So what that means is that 2,100 people in the state of Florida cast one ballot and then cast a second ballot in a different state. So that's clearly illegal and in contravention with any number of laws. And it's also, as you know, more than 4 times or nearly 4 times the margin to victory from the 2000 presidential election, which was decided by 537 votes in the state of Florida. So this idea that voter fraud can't occur on a scale large enough to impact an election, right away we thought, well, that's clearly not the case. And so that's really where I began my research, and then the book takes up from there.
Well, yeah, and there's another example in your book. You bring up New Hampshire, that it was decided by a little more than 1,000 votes, and the senator up there, the Republican senator, lost. Talk about that.
Yeah, so New Hampshire is one of the states with quite a few interesting quirks in their election laws that makes it susceptible for voter fraud. In fact, the Secretary of State of New Hampshire, Secretary Gardner, is one of the few Democrats that doesn't say that there's no evidence of voter fraud, and he says that because he's personally witnessed voter fraud. In the state of New Hampshire, they have what's known as an intent to reside rule. So what happens is that you can show up to vote in New Hampshire, and even if you don't actually live there, but you can say, well, I may want to live there one day. And Secretary Gardner actually witnessed a college student, and this very thing happened to him. There's these get out the vote efforts, and they bring everybody to the polls regardless of the legality of whether you should be casting a ballot or not. And the college student was there, and they said, well, do you live here? And he said, well, no. And so they said, well, I guess I shouldn't cast a ballot. And then a poll worker said, well, actually, do you think you might live here? Because if you might, and if you say you might live here, then you can legally cast a ballot. That's the point of the intent to reside rule. And Secretary of State Gardner was actually on the premises and witnessed this. And here's really the point, is that this guy was able to legally cast a vote. And so that's considered voter fraud to me, Greg. And I would think,
I agree. He had no intention of living there because he lied.
So, but the point is that the Secretary of State was incapable of doing anything about it because of the laws of the land to prevent that from happening. So the left tries to define, when you hear people say there is no evidence of voter fraud, it's because the left uses a very narrow and specific and what lawyers would call an under-inclusive definition. They define voter fraud as only an act of impersonation by an illegal voter on behalf of a legal voter. But as I talked about, the double voting is voter fraud. This guy casting a ballot in New Hampshire is voter fraud. And here's what it means for the recent senatorial election that you referenced. because the senator lost by, I think, 1,000 votes when you had 6,000 ballots cast by people who then subsequently didn't actually register a car in that state, and the follow-up data points that you would look for to say, hey, is this person that actually did end up becoming a legal New Hampshire resident? And the data points suggested that there's actually quite a few thousand votes that were cast by people that didn't end up living in New Hampshire. So that's just one example of a race that was close, in which you have highly suspect questions regarding the outcome.
Ayoade would have won by 5,000 votes, basically.
I mean, there's no way of knowing who would have voted for him. But the point is that when you say there's no evidence of voter fraud, you've got a state where the Secretary of State, the chief elections official in the state, says, no, I've witnessed voter fraud. I wish we could do something to change the laws. And you have the situation in the scenario that you just described. A senator loses a re-election bid by about 1,000 votes, and you have about 5,000 votes that are cast in a highly suspect manner. And, that's not the only one. Senator Al Franken is basically, it's now known that he won his Senate election over Norm Coleman by just a few hundred votes, and it came out several years later that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of fraudulent votes cast. So, yeah, we've seen it happen time and time again. I mean, I've got a whole chapter in the book on the history of voter fraud. I've done a lot of interviews, and people want to bring up JFK or LBJ. And so the idea that we have a history of voter fraud in this country, that's not new, right? So I guess my question would be, what changed? If we know that presidential elections with JFK and LBJ, his congressional track record with ballot box stuffing, that's part of American lore almost. So why would we not think that voter fraud is a problem today?
You have in your book big sweeps here, 240, 250 counties where there's, please explain this to me, more votes than registered voters?
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand that's a key data point, Greg, and I appreciate you bringing it up. But it's important to talk about the context in which those data points occur, right? How do we get to a place where, as you just noted, we have 248 counties in this country that have more registered voters than they have citizens of legal voting age? So how does that happen, right? Because those are clearly errors or bloat on the voter rolls, which, by the way, are the mechanism by which votes are cast. So here's how. And this is why the subtitle of the book is How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. Because what I uncovered in the book, and this is what I document, is that George Soros and the head of the Democratic Party, they basically support efforts to do two things. On the one hand, they fight any effort to increase the legality or security, to increase the security and accuracy of elections in this country. And they do that by fighting states' efforts to implement voter ID laws or to cleanse the voter rolls of illegal voters. And that's documented, that's not up for dispute. The state of Ohio recently, in fact, had to fight Soros-backed efforts to do both those things. George Soros bankrolled lawyers to fight against their implementation of the voter ID law and their successful effort to remove illegal voters from the rolls, which was upheld by the Supreme Court in a recent 5-4 decision. But at the same time, the left funds these groups like La Raza and Acorn, who, by the way, and you know this, Greg, they've had to change their name because of how chronically and how often they were affiliated with voter fraud allegations. So those guys go out and they gather as many voters as possible, regardless of whether they should be casting legal ballots in this country, and they just funnel them through the gaps that exist in our very vulnerable election system. So that's basically the setup. And then so when you have active lawsuits that keep municipalities or keep governments from wanting to take an honest assessment of how accurate their rolls are, then that's how you end up with 248 counties with more registered voters than citizens of legal voting age.
You're telling me that the only way the Democrats can win is to cheat. Is that right?
Well, I didn't say that the only way the Democrats could win is to cheat. I mean, certainly the Democrats win in places where the demographics are favorable to them. But I think that there is evidence of highly suspect behavior. And look, I mean, what's the one thing that we know Tom Perez, the head of the Democratic National Committee, wants to do moving forward, right? So remember what happened in March of this year, I believe, when Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, announced that they were going to be including a question on the 2020 census about citizenship.
Yep.
You heard
they went crazy.
They went crazy. Screams of bloody murder from the left. And I thought that was very telling. And I think that was actually a key piece of evidence in terms of revealing just how this operation plans to move forward. Because Tom Perez, in part of his protestation of the effort to include a question about citizenship on the census, likened it to voter suppression. So you tell me, Greg, how does including a question on the census about citizenship have anything to do with violating the Voting Rights Act or voter suppression? And the answer is because the Democrats have a clear plan to extend and afford additional voting rights to current non-citizens. Tom Perez used to work before he joined the Obama Justice Department, and I talk about this in the book. He used to work for an organization that received a lot of money from George Soros called Casa de Maryland. It's basically an Acorn type of organization, and they were community organizers, but one of their big things was keeping local governments from trying to determine the legality of non-citizens and their status, and also to extend voting rights to non-citizens. Greg, I don't know if you know this, but Tom Perez is from a town in Maryland called Tacoma Park, Maryland, and they've allowed non-citizen voting since 1992. So I personally was shocked to know, I didn't realize non-citizens were legally allowed to vote in this country. And then to find out that people have been doing it since 1992, well, I think it's quite instructive. You know, the past sometimes is the foreshadowing of the future. And I think for Democrats, the future clearly involves allowing more non-citizens to vote. That's why you see pushes in Chicago and New York and in San Francisco to create these municipal IDs so people can have identification cards that they can vote with. And then the key thing is that when they get these cards, the documents used to obtain these cards are then destroyed. So there's no record of who's a legal citizen, who's not. And then you have the extension of voting rights for illegal immigrants in San Francisco and Chicago. And actually, a poll came out recently that for the first time, and this is quite troubling, for the first time, Democrats believe that illegal immigrants that pay taxes should be allowed to legally vote in this country. 53% of self-described liberals, 54% of Democrats believe taxpaying illegal immigrants should be allowed to vote. And that actually stands in significant contrast to the rest of the country.
How much voter fraud was in the 2016 election? I mean, Trump said it was, 3 to 5 million votes of illegal aliens, dead people voting. I mean, Jill Stein was trying to uncover voter fraud. She did. It was Democrats up in Wayne County. But does the president's claim hold water? I mean, Chris Kobach said there's lots of voter fraud. There's lots of illegal aliens voting, lots of election fraud. Project Veritas exposed that. How many votes do you think were cast illegally in America? Do you have any kind of a guess on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it is interesting that you noted that both Jill Stein and supporters of Bernie Sanders complained of fraudulent votes or behavior where votes were being manipulated in favor of the Clinton campaign, right? And those are obviously part of the Democratic structure. In South Florida, actually, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, then the head of the Democratic National Committee, she was up for a close re-election, and the Republican that she was running against challenged the results and flagged it at the local level. Well, the judge said, okay, we're going to take a look at this, so the evidence needs to be preserved. Well, the supervisor of elections in Broward County, which is Florida's second most populous county, and she's got a long history of bizarre and negligent behavior in terms of election administration, she actually destroyed the ballots she basically destroyed the evidence of the Debbie Wasserman Schultz case before an honest review could take place. There's been academic studies that have suggested anywhere from 3 to 6 million ballots were cast by non-citizens in the 2008 election. And I think that's probably what informed President Trump's claim. What we do know...
You think what changed? Nothing.
Well, you tell me. Over the last 8 years, right, under President Obama, did we see a full court press to try to secure elections? Did we really take the issue of non-citizen voting or voter fraud very seriously? No. In fact, the Office of Voter Fraud Prosecution in 8 years under President Obama is one guy who still remains in the job. I believe he prosecuted 3 cases of voter fraud, and that's in 8 years. And those involved cases of actually, I think, trying to buy some votes. So, I don't think it's very likely the problem got less bad from 2008 to 2016.
Well, let's fast forward to today and the midterm elections in 2020, 2018 and 2020. Donald Trump, his voter integrity, I think it's voter integrity committee or group, Chris Kobach, who just won the GOP nomination for governor in, is it Kansas? Yeah. And anyway,
the afterwards from my book.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Good. Anyway, Donald Trump just got frustrated and turned it over to Homeland Security. We now have a Homeland Security issue. Are they cracking down hard on this? Are they? I mean, this is what ICE is deporting all these criminal aliens, and this is what they're doing. How are they going to stop this? Is my question. What do you think is going to happen to cut back on this? Because obviously, the voter fraud is basically fraud in one direction, at least according to your book and according to the evidence.
I think what happened with the Presidential Commission on Voting Integrity is actually quite instructive and consistent with the fact patterns that I document in the book. So basically what happened is that commission was sued from the beginning. And I think that one of the groups that I talk about in the book that's so impactful in terms of dominating the narrative about voting fraud in this country is a group called the Brennan Center. And this is another group that's funded by George Soros. They've received millions of dollars over the last several years from George Soros. And they brag on their website about suing the Voting Commission 19 times. Now remember, the Voting Commission wasn't active for very long. So that they filed 19 different lawsuits in a span of less than a year, I think, is quite telling. So the group folded partly because of the way it was constructed. Given the laws in this country, Secretary of State of Kansas, Chris Kobach, would not have legally been allowed to give the voting data to Presidential Commission on Election Integrity Vice Chair Chris Kobach. So, I mean, there were some problems there. But then also you had the Secretary of State of Maine, who's been quite chatty, bragging about the lack of evidence of voter fraud. Well, he was part of the group that was suing it, right? So he's on the committee, but he's suing the committee to stop it. So I think it's funny that, and you don't hear this brought up in much of the media coverage, but it's funny that he's out there saying, oh, there's no evidence, but that's because he was part of the active effort to sue to stop it from doing its job, right? I mean, if you're not looking for something, then you're not going to find it. So he actively sued the group to get it to stop looking for it, and then he brags about the fact that they didn't find anything. And that's consistent with the way the left tends to operate on any discussion of voter fraud.
They lie. They lie and they cheat. I mean, what else can you say?
Right.
I mean, they caught it on camera. Project Veritas caught it on camera. Bob Kramer was at the White House dozens of times. He had one-on-one meetings with the presidents, reportedly. I mean, that's a huge campaign, too. That's why they were so upset. They couldn't cheat enough votes in. But you think there's, let me just regress here just for a second. You think there's, the evidence shows there's 3 to 6 million votes in 2008 cast by people that shouldn't have casted them. A lot of them are illegal aliens. And you think that probably went right through to 2016.
Well, here's, I think, an important thing to note is in Pennsylvania, which is one of the 3 states that everybody points to as saying it swung the presidential election. For the 3 million votes that were cast in the populace, for the 3 million vote difference in the popular vote, right? 70,000 votes in 3 states essentially swung the presidential election. And one of those states was Pennsylvania. And there's been follow-up investigation. This is really the key for any honest and thorough investigation into voter fraud is it's not going to come from the people that administer the elections, right? It has to come from lawyers working on behalf of campaigns. It has to come from local media, because that's where the honesty will be uncovered. So after the 2016 elections, they noticed that the voter rolls in Pennsylvania had lots of problems, and it's now estimated, and evidence increasingly is becoming public, that as many as 100,000 non-citizens were on the voting rolls in Pennsylvania. And so as people began to ask more questions, the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania actually just resigned and said, all right, and that was their way of essentially ending that discussion. But I think it's very fair to ask and take an honest assessment and thorough analysis of, well, what do the voter rolls look like, and what do they tell us? But again, that's why it's funny that the left sues to stop that from happening, and then they say, well, you haven't found anything. Well, why haven't they found anything? Because you sued to keep anybody from looking. So the fact that they are so litigious in nature and seem so aggressive in preventing an honest analysis, I think, is quite telling.
How are they going to stop this year? Is Homeland Security going to be stepping in? Are they going to have people at the voter booths, the Homeland Security out there looking for illegal aliens voting? I mean, they gave driver's license in the state of California, and check here if you'd like to vote, whether you're a citizen or not. I mean, how are they going to cut down on this in 2018 and 2020?
Yeah, it's a great point, right? There's 1 million illegal immigrants in California that have driver's licenses. And as you just noted, and people may or may not know this, I was actually quite surprised to learn this, that registering to vote is as simple as checking a box when you get your driver's license.
Yep.
I've actually spoken to immigration attorneys who are very concerned because what happens is the system is so vulnerable, partly at the behest of these aggressive, litigious leftist groups that keep any increases in security from happening. But then what that does is that it actually creates victims for these unwitting non-citizens who don't necessarily know what the law says. They don't know what they're supposed to do or not do. And so as I talk about in the book, there's numerous examples of people who they were trying to do the right thing. They thought they were allowed to vote. So they got the driver's license, they registered, these are non-citizens, they cast ballots, and then they end up facing deportation, not because they were some criminal enterprise looking to undermine American democracy, but just because they wanted to participate in the system.
Listen, I don't care. They're here illegally. You committed a crime to come here.
Right.
Half of them are on food stamps, and so this the idea that, they're just hardworking people. You committed a crime, you're a criminal. Illegal aliens are criminals, period.
Yeah, but I think the key point on that is that and the reason why I bring it up is that the left, their policies and their aggressive attitude towards election security actually ends up victimizing and exploiting the groups that they purport to want to protect. And so it's really, I think, quite hypocritical on the part of the left to contest your point, right? And they act like it's not really that big of a deal. Yet at the same time, they're creating more criminals by preventing any other safeguards. So, what's going to happen? I think we need to see voter ID at the local level. And you hear a lot of pushback about that. Oh, well, these people are racist if you try to impose a voter ID because it's just going to
cut into their votes.
Yeah, you're going to suppress minority turnout. Well,
hold on, I just want to ask you something real quick.
Yeah.
You think that the left in a lot of areas, the Democratic Socialist, that's a lot like National Socialist. But anyway, you think the left in a lot of areas has to cheat to win?
Yeah, I think there's clear evidence that they are actively working to create an environment that makes cheating as possible and likely as it could be, right? I mean, that's why, put it this way, what Democrats have ever aggressively pursued charges of voting fraud? I talk in the case about...
Jill Stein did, and she uncovered just the opposite.
Well,
thank you, Jill Stein.
So I have a case in the book of something that happened in South Florida. And this is, it's a great example for a number of reasons. So you've got these three people that were running for office, both at the county and then the state legislative level. And they were of Haitian descent. And a follow-up investigation after the election noted hundreds of absentee ballot request forms had been filled out and sent in, all with the same signature. And then
that just happened.
Yeah, no, this is from a couple years ago.
2016. Okay.
Yeah, and then bundles of absentee ballots were actually then dropped off by employees of the campaign. And so the election supervisor actually flagged it and said, hey, this is a problem. This is not indicative of an honest and fair election. I think we need to investigate. So they had 13 sheriff's deputies come together and they gathered all sorts of evidence and they turned it over to the state attorney's office. Well, the state attorney is an elected position and he's a Democrat. And he's somebody that's held state legislative office prior, and he has future political ambitions. So despite the clear evidence, and even the newspaper said, this is clear evidence of voter fraud, the state attorney didn't prosecute. And the reason is because if you're a Democrat politician and you have further political aspirations, do you think it's going to help your career if you attack a group of Haitians or any ethnic minority who votes reliably Democrat and prosecute them for voter fraud?
Yeah, but they should have done it though. It's a crime.
And in fact, I actually spoke a couple weeks ago to a group of election law attorneys, and these are people who have been attorneys, but these are also prosecutors and judges. And they came up and they thanked me for writing this book, and they were very appreciative that I was shedding so much light on the issue. And they said, "Listen, I've been in the position where I was asked and tasked with the idea of bringing charges for voter fraud, and I didn't do it." Because I didn't need the hassle of being called a racist. Plus, I have limited resources in my office as a prosecutor, and I'm going to spend them on going after violent offenders or crimes against children. And I'm not going to go after a thing that, quite honestly, is very difficult to prove because of the evidence. So I do think you just touched on something where, if more people would look for it, I think, as I did, you would find it.
But there has to be
But
some kind of a plan for 2016. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
What's that?
There has to be some kind of a plan to cut back on this in 2018 and
So, yeah.
2020.
I think requiring ID, if you or I want to buy a beer, want to get on an airplane, or if you wanted to go to the Democratic National Convention in 2016, you needed a driver's license. So I don't think it's wrong to ask people to have a driver's license when they want to vote. I think at the state level, we need to see what states like Ohio and Indiana have done, and that's do an honest audit of their voter rolls and remove people that shouldn't be there. Yet you see left organizations that are source funded fight to block that at every turn. And then I think at the federal level, we should have some kind of verification for citizenship when you register to vote, because that doesn't happen now, and that leads to a lot of the problems like the 248 counties that you mentioned earlier in the broadcast.
Have you heard anything from the Trump administration that they're going to actively do to cut down on the voter fraud and election fraud?
I have not heard from the Trump administration yet, but I do quote one of the lawyers who's been leading the charge on this front, Jay Christian Adams, and his group's actually the one that uncovered the 248 counties issue. He's uncovered the non-citizen votes in Virginia and New Jersey and elsewhere. And he said, and this quote's in the book, he said, the good news is we do have a president like President Trump who is laser focused on the issue, and he is informing quite a few people.
So they've got some plans to try to step in and cut way back on this. I mean, that my sources say they have some plans to do that. They're going to be really working at cutting back, and it's also been kind of turned over to Homeland Security. So now it's a national security issue, and it is a national security. You talk about foreigners tampering with their elections. What are illegal aliens voting? What are dead people voting? This is a national security issue, right?
Yeah, the sanctity and security of American elections is absolutely a national security issue.
Well, I got to tell you, I'm going to cut it short here, but I'd like to have you back on. I know you've had a round of interviews. You're a fascinating guy. I'd love to have you on closer when you find out more about more fraud, because I don't think it's going to go away. I mean, it's been going on for decades, including that's how Kennedy was elected. They now, within West Virginia and Chicago and Illinois, they're well documented voter fraud, right?
Absolutely. And that's my point, is that we know voter fraud's occurred historically, and I've got a whole chapter on the history of voter fraud. George Washington's first election was considered voter fraud because he bribed people with better alcohol than his opponent when the elections were held at a bar. So, voter fraud is ingrained in the fabric of our nation. So I don't think it's a stretch, and I think it's actually just quite reasonable to take a look at how it's impacting America today.
Yeah, well, Nixon, Watergate was all about Nixon didn't want to be cheated out of the presidency again. That's why the whole Watergate break-in happened.
Right.
Yeah, I'll tell you, after watching this failed coup, I remember as a kid watching Nixon go, I am not a crook. And everybody laughed at that, but he wasn't. He was freaked out. He shouldn't have done the Watergate thing. But that was nothing compared to the attempted coup of a duly elected president. They tried to fraud him out of it, and they couldn't do it. Then they tried to kick him out of office. So we have a tough couple of years to go. But the book, Eric Eggers, Fraud, it's how the left plans to steal the next election. Fascinating book. It's a quick read, but it's a staccato read with one example after another, almost 40 pages of footnotes and sources. Eric Eggers, thanks for joining us today, and I'll put all the links up to your webpage, which has the book right on the front cover. Eric Eggers, thanks for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.